was a study by Wang and colleagues at Educational Testing Service that looked at word reading and comprehension data for hundreds of thousands of kids nationwide from grades 4 and up. And what they found was that in their word recognition and decoding task, there was what they called a decoding threshold. And that means that if kids had achieved a certain level of decoding skill by the end of 5th grade, they continued to grow in their comprehension skills throughout middle school and high school and benefit from comprehension instruction. If they did not meet that threshold, then they did not demonstrate comprehension growth after 5th grade. And there are lots of different possible reasons for that, including a mismatch between the instruction that they would get in middle school and high school and the skills that they need. But basically, this is what we think of as a prerequisite for comprehension growth. And they estimated that about 38% of 5th grade students do not meet that threshold nationwide in that original paper. As I said, I was at the American Educational Research Association conference last weekend, and I actually set up a symposium so I could present with the guys who did this original study and learn more about this test, more about the data, and more about their research on this topic, because I'm getting so many questions. It was almost like, it was something, when I presented this in February, I got a bunch of emails and a bunch of questions about what this is. Where is it? How do we know if kids have it? And so I've been trying to delve a little bit more deeply into that topic, and I'm excited to share what I found with you today. Basically, the ETS researchers have now replicated that original study where they took a second large cohort and demonstrated the existence of that same decoding threshold on their task. And they also dug a little bit more deeply into what the kids who are below the decoding threshold are doing when they're taking their word recognition assessment. So I want to show you what that looks like. Their estimate now is more around 25% of kids nationwide, which is a little bit better, are below that decoding threshold. But it varies quite considerably from school to school and context to context. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what this test actually is, because I think when we hear the word decoding, what are we picturing? CVC words, right? We're picturing kids in kindergarten and 1st grade decoding CVC words and just sounding them out. And we're picturing them sounding out words that are pretty familiar, right? Like dog, cat, that kind of thing. Okay, here's what the actual task involves. It involves looking at a word on the screen. It's a computer-based assessment, and deciding if it is a real word, a nonsense word, or a pseudo-homophone. Now, they don't use that word with the kids. They use sound, but it means it sounds like a real word. So there's 3 different types of items. Which ones do you think are the hardest for the kids which ones do you think are the hardest for the kids below that decoding threshold? What was that? Nonsense words? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And pseudo-homophones. Yes, you are correct. So here's what it looks like. They show a word, and you have to say, is this a real word, not a real word, or sounds exactly like a real word? So you can't just look at it and say, I know it or I don't know it, real word or not real. You have to stop and process it phonologically, and then decide if it sounds like a real word. So let's pretend we're kids. Is this a real word, not a real word, sounds like a real word? All right. Yep. Mm-hmm. All right, so which ones of these questions would be the hardest for kids below the decoding threshold? Blue, absolutely. So what they've found is that these items are the hardest for kids below the decoding threshold because they don't attempt them. They look at a word, they don't recognize it, and they do not engage in the phonological process to figure out if it sounds like a real word or not. They just say not a real word, and they move on to the next one. So they spend much less time attempting to read unfamiliar words than kids above the decoding threshold. So I thought that was interesting. I want to point out that this concern about kids in the upper elementary grade goes all the way back to Jean Shaw, who was who invented the stages of reading development. And she really argued that there's this learning to read phase in grades K, 1, and 2. And then kids are shifting into reading to learn. And we've kind of given up on those 2 categories because we think kids should learn learn to read and read to learn the entire time in both that they're in school. But there was this documented phenomenon of the fourth grade slump that she noticed and other researchers noticed years ago. And it has to do with the increasing text volume that kids have to tackle at this stage. That reading challenge increases as kids get into third and fourth grade, right? They've been reading words, lots of books that have those CVC or CVCE, silent E word patterns, lots of single syllable words. And then they are developing, and then they have to engage with texts that have longer and more difficult words, particularly in their informational text reading. And that was one of the things that Jean Shaw believed was the cause of the fourth grade slump, was the increasing demands of informational text reading that include words like disorganization, equilibrium, and naturalization.